Hiya! Today I'd like to talk to you about different types of ink pads. Now, one of the things that puts some people off stamping is the confusion around different types of ink pads that you need to use when you're performing different techniques and using different colouring mediums. It can sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming as a beginner. However, I want to break this down for you and show you that it's actually really simple and really easy. You've just got to remember a few key points and you will be away with your stamping. So lots of different types of ink pads, and I've got several here. They come in not only different colours, so you can see I've got a beautiful pink one there, more plain black ink pads here, but also different types of ink composition. So one of the types of ink pads we do have within the craft market, and perhaps one of the most common, is dye-based ink pads. Now within this category of dye ink pads, we have both water-based dye ink pads and waterproof. Now dye ink pads are all water-based as the dye is dissolved in a liquid like water, which makes them water-based. And what you'll find is they're quite thin-bodied. When you stamp using a dye-based ink pad, it actually sinks into the fibres of the card. It doesn't sit on the surface, and this makes them quite quick drying. That means that they're not ideal for embossing with using embossing powders, as that ink dries quite quickly. And also with them being fairly thin bodied, they don't show up well on darker cards, so they're best to use with your paler cardstocks like your white cardstock. So what I've got here is a Memento ink pad, and this is a type of dye-based ink pad. This is a permanent dye-based ink pad and it's waterproof. And as we can see, it says on the ink pad here that it's a dye ink. Now Memento, as you can see, this is a black Memento ink pad. It's the perfect ink pad to use when you're colouring using alcohol pens, because when you colour over the top using your alcohol pens, the Memento ink underneath will not bleed or run. So Memento is a dye-based ink, perfect for use with your alcohol pens. I wouldn't recommend it for using with your embossing powders as it dries too quickly. Distress inks are actually a form of dye ink as well, but they dry slightly more slowly than most dye inks, so they can be used with embossing powders if you wish, and they work slightly better on glossy surfaces, as most dye ink pads will not dry on your non-porous surfaces, so they're for use for things like paper and card rather than acetates, as you'll find they won't dry on those surfaces. So your distress inks are perfect for doing your blending techniques and your backgrounds with, and they come in a vast array of different colours. So there's lots and lots of different colours you can choose from depending on your project and your preferences. So as you can see, they come in a square ink pad. There's lots of different shapes and sizes of ink pads on the market that you will find, but they're perfect for your blending techniques. You will find that if you stamp using a distress ink, it will give you a slightly distressed look. You won't get a crisp image, and you will sometimes find that with certain dye inks. You don't get a perfectly crisp image, as the dye ink can pull slightly on your stamp. To combat that, you can first ink up your stamp using a clear sticky ink like your VersaFine, and then the dye ink will adhere to that layer of ink rather than to the stamp itself, and you should get a more crisp impression. Aside from dye ink pads, we also have, and as you can see here, I've got a rare earth dye ink pad, and that's pitch black. We've also got pigment ink pads. Now these are thicker bodied than your dye ink pads because they tend to have a glycerin base. They're perfect for stamping on darker cards. With them being thicker bodied, you will get a better impression. You will find that they show up better on darker cards than you will with your dye ink pads. But they do dry slower, which can be a benefit because they're perfect to use with your embossing powders. So once you've stamped using your ink pad, you can sprinkle embossing powder over the top, use a heat gun to melt it, and you've got a beautifully embossed finish. So VersaFine is an example of a pigment ink pad. You will find that it gives you beautiful crisp images every time and picks up the fine details in your stamps. So that's pigment based, and you can use your pigment base with any water based colouring medium. So once it's dried, and you may want to heat set it given it is slow drying, you will find that you can use your watercolour pencils, you can colour using your ink pads, using watercolour pens, use your watercolour concentrates with your pigment based ink pads, and you will not get them to bleed. However, I would not recommend using alcohol pens with your pigment ink pads, as the ink will bleed. We've also got solvent based ink pads like StazOn. Now these are a little bit harsher than most ink pads. They do have potentially destructive properties with clear stamps, so use them only if you really need to. So that would be if you are wanting to stamp onto a non-porous surface such as acetate. You'll find that a solvent based ink pad like StazOn will dry on your non-porous surfaces, which gives you lots of options. So you can see it will be permanent on both porous and non-porous surfaces. And again, it comes in a range of different colours depending on your project, your preferences. But of course you can stamp onto your non-porous surfaces with them, which is a real benefit of your solvent-based ink pads. In addition, we've also got hybrid ink pads, and these are a bit newer to the crafting market, and they're actually really exciting. So Rare Earth do their reaction ink pads, and these are hybrid inks, which means they're a fusion of both dye and pigment ink, and that gives us lots of different options because we kind of get the best of both worlds. They have some of the properties of dye ink pads and some of the properties of pigment ink pads. So what you'll find is you'll get a crisp stamped image as you would with a pigment ink pad. But because they dry slightly slower, you can actually heat emboss with them. They are perfect for blending with, and you can actually do your techniques with splattering water over the top with them, and it'll bleach out the colour, which is a fantastic technique. They do dry slightly quicker than your traditional pigment because of the dye properties within that ink pad, but you can still heat emboss with them if you're a little bit quicker. So as you can see, there's lots of different options when it comes to ink pad. They have lots of different uses, but don't forget, if you're wanting to use your alcohol pens, Memento is the one to go for. If you're wanting to use a water-based medium, a pigment ink pad like VersaFine is perfect. And ink pads come in lots of different colours, lots of different shapes and sizes, and there's definitely an ink pad for any project that you're doing with your stamping.